Sorry. This is a video which was sent to us by a viewer in the chat. It's a CNBC video, Why Democratic Socialism is Gaining Popularity in the United States. So I'm assuming that I will have some issues with their definition of democratic socialism and their presentation of it, but I have not seen this video, so I'll be reacting to it off the dome. We're going to play at 1.25 speed because that seems pretty good. And let's get rolling.
Socialism used to be a really scary word in the United States. It helped fuel the Red Scare when Congress carried out massive witch hunts to weed out suspected American communists and traitors after each World War.
Our job as Americans and as Republicans is to dislodge the traitors from every place where they've been sent to do their traitorous work.
So for those who don't know where the term McCarthyism comes from, little educational break here. McCarthyism meaning anti-communism in the U.S. It's named after Joseph McCarthy, who was a senator from my home state of Wisconsin, who basically launched these anti-communist programs, anti-communist propaganda. We saw the infiltration of leftist organizations and the purposeful dismantling of them and turning them against each other from the inside, COINTELPRO. We saw the House of Un-American Activities was formed, and they would basically do witch hunts for communists and investigate them. Paul Robeson, a famous black communist, gave a great testimony against the House of Un-American committees that we've watched on the stream before. So that's all called McCarthyism, basically post-World War II anti-communism in the U.S. and the rooting out of communism from our society by the ruling class. And a lot of that was headed up by this guy, Joseph McCarthy.
From every place where they've been sent to do their traitorous work.
Until recently, though, socialism had been relegated to the sidelines of American politics, and it's taken on more of a positive connotation thanks in large part to Bernie Sanders from Vermont.
When I talk about
So that's interesting. Interesting that they say that it's taken a shift to politics. And I assume they mean from economics to politics, which is interesting. And that's true. You see democratic socialists and people who refer to them as socialists in the West today are primarily hyper-focused on the political realm, which is what we were just talking about, which is what I don't love talking about American politics, because nothing ever really changes. So people are hyper-focused on politics and everything that goes on in Washington, when socialism is really about organizing workplaces, right? Organizing people based upon class lines so that they can not only fight political battles and form organs of political power that represent workers, but also fight economic battles, right? Fight the battles against the boss at the workplace, organize themselves so they can strike and demand various different things. This is the Marxist idea of class struggle. So I would agree with them that democratic socialism in the modern form in the U.S. at least has moved to hyper-focusing on the political, which is one of my main primary critiques of modern socialism, was that we need to get, the politics are important, yes, the workers should look to seize political power, but that's only going to come about through workplace organizing on the ground, organizing people into unions, making the current unions stronger and more so representatives of the workers rather than union bureaucracy. Things like that are how we wage class struggle and how we achieve socialism, more so than voting or complaining about politicians on Twitter.
democratic socialism,
No offense to anyone who does that. I complain about politicians on Twitter plenty.
I am talking about Medicare. When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm not looking at Venezuela. I'm not looking at Cuba. I'm looking at countries like Denmark and Sweden.
See? And I hate that. And that's also part of the major problem with democratic socialism, is it totally ignores imperialism. Because it's totally focused on the political. So it goes, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, their political systems are closer to ours. They're closer to liberal democracies. But Cuba and China, those are one-party states, right? Even though those countries have more voting and more democratic systems than any of those systems in the West. But because they're looking at things politically exclusively rather than looking at things economically, they don't understand why countries like China and Cuba have had to do the things they've done, and why these countries, and countries like Venezuela, even although it's a very different situation than Cuba and China, not a one-party state, but why those countries have been in relative poverty, why they haven't been able to thrive, well, until China today now has taken off. But it's largely because of imperialism and because of economic sanctions and because of holding these countries under embargo and military actions against these countries. So again, the hyper-focus on the political kind of distracts people, I think, and social democrats in the U.S. or democratic socialists in the U.S. from seeing the economic warfare that is waged against socialist experiments, other socialist countries. Yeah.
2016 presidential contender was a self-proclaimed democratic socialist who tapped into a huge and angry voting bloc of the country's disillusioned youth.
Financing college for all students in America really resonates with me.
Workers' rights,
climate change.
He's planting the seed,
Closing the wage gap.
He cares about black students on this campus.
This is a movement that's going to exist for many, many years to come.
Sanders made socialism cool. He also paved the way for the rise of other charismatic politicians like him. House Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had volunteered on the Sanders campaign before deciding to run for Congress herself. She was an overnight sensation after her unprecedented victory in 2018.
Despite the fact that we were running against a 10-term incumbent, despite the fact that we didn't have the money, despite the fact that I'm working class, despite all those things, we won.
AOC fervor has swept.
And AOC is a great example, you know, she just wanted to get in the political system, you know, let's get a working class representative of socialism within the political system. And, you know, now anytime people try and hold her accountable, like, why aren't you fighting harder for Medicare for all and these various things that you campaigned on, it's always like, well, you know, we have to look at where the Republicans are at and we have to try and compromise to get small gains for workers. It's like, that's not socialism. This is liberal technocracy. Right? Because once you get within our corrupt, rancid political system, it's really, really hard to fight for the working class because you're surrounded by corruption, surrounded by people like Nancy Pelosi and lobbyists and donors. There's a reason they call it the swamp. Yeah, it's just another flaw with only focusing on the political and trying to make our solutions political or only achieving power through the ballot box. Before organizing workers at the workplace on the ground.
Swept the country.
We are in a moment where socialism is no longer a dirty word because people are affiliating it with those candidates who are already incredibly popular.
But this swell of popularity has also triggered new fervor against socialism.
Democrat lawmakers are now embracing socialism. They want to replace individual rights with total government domination.
So is this political zeitgeist that's upsetting the status quo a fad or the future of politics in America?
Tell me what democracy looks like.
This is what democracy looks like.
And of course I worked for the Bernie campaign, and I think it was overall positive because it spread socialist ideas across the country and did make socialism a more acceptable term. But at the same time, the campaign demonized Venezuela, Cuba, China, the DPRK, Vietnam, all these existing socialist countries every step of the way. So it's like we did kind of change people's view about socialism, but you know, we just said we're going to do Denmark's Norway, Sweden style system, which isn't socialism. You know, and then we said these countries who are actually trying to build socialism, like Cuba and China, we said, you know, they're evil, they're authoritarian dictatorships. That's not what we want to be. So it's like more so, I think, than popularizing socialism, which was part of it, you know, definitely a benefit. But the campaign also distorted people's idea of what socialism is. And there are a lot of people who were involved with Bernie who since Bernie have started reading theory and getting more into the more core principles of socialism historically. But, you know, there's a lot of people who still think that Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are socialism and Cuba's this evil comic book villain. So it's definitely a negative that came out of the campaign as far as how it affected the public's view of socialism.
To understand democratic socialism in America, it's best to start with the basics. Capitalism, socialism, and communism exist along a sort of economic spectrum. At one end, the government has total control over the economy, and at the other, little to none. Socialism is somewhere in between the two. It's a
I hate this. I'm so tired of seeing this definition. And I mean, in some ways, it's kind of right. You know, like socialism is progressively more control for the people as opposed to corporations until you get to communism. So there is like a spectrum, but it's not like, you know, some people are socialists, so they think the government should control 50% of the economy. And then there are people who are communists, and they think the government should control 100% of the economy. Like, that's not how it works. There are people who are like democratic socialists or social democrats who believe in keeping capitalism, but making certain adjustments or certain government interventions so that the working class has a better standard of living. But that's social democracy, right? That's not socialism. Communists believe that workers need to take power of the government from the capitalists who currently own the government. And if you look at the American government, that's blatantly obvious. That is the capitalist class who controls our government, so that workers can use the state apparatus to transition to a socialist mode of production, to move the means of production into their hands. And that's where the transition comes in. As workers are constructing this society where they have control of production, where they have control of the levers of power, you see the transition out of capitalism and into communism, out of class society where the capitalists have all the power into a society where the workers have all the power, socialism, into a society where there's no classes at all, communism. But the idea that you just put this on a spectrum and say, you know, socialism is like 20% government ownership and communism is 100%. It makes no sense. Venezuela, you know, is the number one American example of socialism failing or whatever. And they point at Venezuela and go, that's socialism. Venezuela has less of their industry government owned than like France, right? Than most European countries. They've renationalized their oil industry and used that to pay for social programs as part of their socialist project. And they've also created all these communes, which are like funded and supported by the government to create a socialist ethic among their people. But the government owns less of their economy than like France. Yet France is capitalist and Venezuela is socialist. It makes no sense. This timeline here that liberals always put capitalism, socialism, and communism on makes zero sense, and it is unhelpful and confusing.
System where the government has nationalized most all major industries, but unlike communism, property and resources aren't owned and controlled by the state. Instead, the government redistributes the wealth to individuals in a way it deems fair and equitable.
Industry is nationalized, but property and resources are not. What are resources? How are resources not included in industry? What produces commodities? And resources are what go into industry.
Democratic socialism lies somewhere between socialism and capitalism, depending on whom you talk to. For some, this system is pro-market. Others want to abolish capitalism entirely, but they do agree on more government control, ensuring...
So they added even another category. They said this is democratic socialism. It's even different than socialism. Okay.
Things like universal healthcare and tuition-free college, funded through expanded taxes on corporations and the rich, much like the kind of system that you see in Scandinavia or Iceland.
Sounds like socialism.
And like CNBC is a mainstream media outlet with tons of money. And, you know, not to be Mr. Oh, we have to use academic terms all the time and we have to use the right vocabulary because, you know, I got my bachelor's in political science. But, like, it is very, very basic to understand what social democracy is, right? To understand a system like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway that's based on capitalism but has these things like free education and free healthcare to make a better living standard for the working class or middle class. You know, this is a very basic ideology. Social democratic parties have existed for so long, and they played, you know, a very important role in, say, World War II in Germany, where the Social Democrats ended up collaborating with Hitler and the right-wing fascists against the communists. So it's a very different thing than communism and socialism, but it's not democratic socialism. It's called social democracy, and it's been a basic political concept forever. Which, you know, I don't expect normal people to know that or workers to know that, but this is a news outlet trying to educate people on politics. Like, why not explain, like, why do you not know what social democracy is? Why are you creating this weird timeline with capitalism, communism, democratic socialism, but, you just made this shit up. You're just pulling it out of your ass. Like, it'd be a great, what if we had a news media that actually explained to people what political ideologies are and the historical legacy of those political ideologies? But if they did that, then everybody would see that communists have always been on the right side, so they can't do that.
To me, democratic socialism. What's the difference? Huge difference.
But to understand why the debate over socialism in the US is so heated, you need to know a little history too. Here's a crash course. Even before German radicals Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels released the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the ideals of socialism had already taken root in the United States. After Thomas Paine's famous writings helped drive patriots to war with the British, he soon took on a new cause, taxing wealthy landowners to help pay for a basic income for all citizens. Sound familiar? He didn't call it socialism, but it checked a lot of the boxes. Over the 19th century, these socialist principles incubated in labor unions.
So now we're going to see their history of socialism, which should be interesting. And I want to point out, I like that they pointed out that socialism existed before Marx and Engels, because that's something that a lot of media outlets in the West miss. They say that Marx and Engels invented socialism. Not true. They came up with the idea of scientific socialism. Prior to them, there were a lot of utopian socialists, and Midwestern Marx just released a video about Robert Owen and the Utopian Socialists by Mitchell Jones, who's a historian. So if you want history on utopian socialism that's a lot better than this one from CNBC, go check out Mitch's video.
And later flourished during the Industrial Revolution, when wealth was suddenly highly concentrated among an elite few in this Gilded Age. Capitalism became a common enemy for a population that felt left behind. In 1901, a few pro-socialist groups banded together to form the Socialist Party of America. Within a decade, socialist candidates began winning multiple local, state, and national level elections. By 1912, the party even ran a competitive candidate for president. But then came the First World War, the overthrow of imperialist Russia, and the rise of an oppressive communist Soviet Union. The U.S. government cracked down on perceived disloyalty at home in what became known as the First Red Scare.
There had been nationwide raids, and the public seemed glad to have any type of radical brought to trial.
American socialism continued to decline in the 1920s, and in the aftermath of the Great Depression, President FDR's New Deal of the
I like how they called the Soviet Union authoritarian, as opposed to Tsarist Russia, as opposed to imperialist Russia. Because CNBC, you just brought up imperialist Russia, right? And then you said they were overthrown, and that put in an authoritarian government. But the Tsar, who would murder people and were sending Russian people constantly to fight in nonsensical wars for expansion and greed, and constantly allowed their people to die of famine due to avoidable shortages, that wasn't authoritarian. Only the government that overthrew them was authoritarian. Seems like a bit of a double standard. I'm not saying the Soviet Union wasn't authoritarian, right? They definitely had to have strict rules at the beginning if they were going to survive. You know, they were attacked. They had civil war. Then they were attacked by all of the Western countries, all of them. They had economic sanctions put on them. And they had to industrialize their country and build up their military before the German Nazis would invade later, about just over 20 years after the revolution. So there were definitely authoritarian practices that had to be put in place in order to accomplish all these things. But to act like imperialist Tsarist Russia, which gave the workers the incentive to overthrow the government and create the USSR, to act like they weren't authoritarian, but the USSR was, is absolutely absurd. And it shows the Western double standard that we have for governments that we like versus socialist experiments.
1930s, which promoted huge public works projects and programs like Social Security, only further served to steal the party's thunder.
A rolling ball of economic recovery gathers thousands of men and women every week.
With the end of World War II and the fall of Nazi Germany leaving a huge power vacuum in Western Europe.
So that was important there. We've been talking a lot about economic organizing versus political organizing. CNBC actually did a good job of showing how socialism was popular and started amongst the workers, with the workers' unions. And because these unions had so much power, and because the Communist Party was gaining so much power and so much popularity with the workers were able to demand all these things like Social Security, Medicare, and eventually the New Deal. All these works programs from the government, from FDR, which went to benefit workers. That was because they were organized. And that was because the government was scared of communism. So through class struggle, workers were able to demand these things. Demand this social safety net, which has largely been dismantled since this time as the organization and bargaining power of workers has gone down, down, down.
The democratic U.S. and its Western allies began a global, multi-decade battle against the communist USSR and its satellite states. Being a socialist was suddenly as good as being a communist, which was synonymous with being an enemy of the state. Republican Senator Joe McCarthy led the infamous Second Red Scare of the 1950s.
The man assigned this communist pledge is a pledge to support the Communist Party.
It was a brutal and public witch hunt designed to identify anyone from communist sympathizers to secret Soviet agents. No one was free from scrutiny, not schoolteachers, artists, or journalists.
Have you no sense of decency, sir? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough.
Then the pendulum swung the other way. The 1960s saw the start of a multi-decade surge in left-wing politics. From the counterculture to civil rights and the anti-war movement, liberal politics became mainstream.
See, they're conflating liberal politics with communism. Because the hippie movement was not a communist movement. It was more of a middle-class student movement, professional managerial class student movement, which, you know, the CIA was putting LSD and psychedelics out on the streets and promoting these things in a lot of ways because they thought it took away from worker organization and it made communism look like this crazy hippie trippy thing rather than just the organization of workers and the fighting for their interests. You can Google the Congress for Cultural Freedom if you want. It's this program by the CIA where they promoted a lot of these countercultural hippie tendencies and tried to conflate that with communism. So unless you know that history, it's easy to say, you know, the communist movement just became like Woodstock hippies in the 60s, but there's a lot more to it than that. This was when COINTELPRO was going on, when the U.S. government had fairly well infiltrated every single left-wing party or group in the entirety of the United States. They were turning them against each other. They were crumbling groups from the inside. So basically the communist movement and all this worker organization dissolved at this time, despite the fact that there was a really strong anti-Vietnam War effort, which is a benefit, a good thing that came out of it for sure.
But even with this resurgence of liberal ideas, socialism had faded to the background. Fast forward to 1980.
Even with this resurgence of liberal ideas, socialism had faded to the background. Exactly. Because liberalism isn't socialism, so that those liberal ideas were promoted from within left-wing organizations by the CIA to promote liberalism and demote socialism.
And we have a remarkable development here tonight at the Brandenburg Gate. On the other side, East Germans have now come to the wall, and many of them have been seen crawling up on the wall, being helped across by West Germans from this side.
Down came the Berlin Wall.
I wonder if they'll talk about the economic catastrophe which followed this in East Germany, with the neoliberal shock therapy that was imposed upon them by capitalists or the bourgeoisie of their own country and abroad. I'm sure they'll just skip over that part and act like nothing bad happened at all after the Berlin Wall fell down. It was just peace, harmony, and they all sang Kumbaya.
And with it, the end of the Cold War. The atrocities of autocratic communist states were on the world stage, and for a couple decades, the U.S. was happy to promote the win for democracy and capitalism, while socialism largely slipped out of the lexicon. But then came the 2008 financial crisis.
Lehman here is going bankrupt.
Some of the biggest names in American business are tonight gone, along with a lot of money and a lot of jobs.
As millennials came into adulthood, the formative images seared into their minds weren't of the fall of the Berlin Wall, but of a financial meltdown.
The foreclosure rate in this area right now is over 400%.
It's a war up there. I mean, these people are losing homes every single day.
You got people sleeping on the street, sleeping on bus shelter. Is that where I'm going to end up?
Stories like these pushed the country to a breaking point. Public outrage poured into the streets.
It's not the worst video ever. I disagree with some of the characterizations of socialism and their explanations of socialism, but I mean, they make a good point by talking about the 2008 financial crisis. Like after 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you know, we had people saying it's the end of history, liberalism, you know, will go on forever. But then you have the economic conditions here within the wealthiest country in the world deteriorate for workers, largely with the 2008 financial crisis. So the material conditions, as Marx said they would, are pushing people towards democratic socialism or social democracy, and towards full-on socialism and Marxism, which, you know, if more people realize that class struggle is the way forward, then we could really see some change in